All right, welcome back. Hope you had a great weekend. Today we're continuing our RBT exam review with our latest practice exam. We're going to go through the next set of questions together and break them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. If you're looking for our proven study materials, please check out btexamreview.com. We have our 3 practice exams, a task list study guide, and of course our famous combo pack. You can also join our YouTube if you would like to support us further. Other than that, let's work hard, study hard, get to our questions. Question 1. You're on a Zoom meeting for your class. The professor calls your name, and as you are speaking, he tells you that you're muted, so you unmute yourself. The professor telling you that you're muted is a what relative to unmuting yourself? When you get a behavior question, which is asking about MOs and SDs and consequences, it's very important before you try to figure out the question that you identify what's the behavior you're looking at and what are we looking at in terms of antecedents and consequences, because there's a lot going on in this question. Right? So if the antecedent is the professor calling your name and your response is speaking, and the consequences he tells you that you are muted, well, relative to that, telling you that you're muted is a consequence. But the question is saying relative to you unmuting yourself. So what's actually occurring is this telling you that you're muted is both a consequence for speaking and a antecedent to unmuting yourself. So you have to be able to identify those antecedents and those consequences to get these questions right. Because what's happening is the professor says you are muted, which is the antecedent. And so your response is you unmute yourself. So the professor telling you that you're muted is what relative to unmuting yourself is going to be an SD. It isn't an MO, it's not a prompt, and it's not a consequence because it's happening before, right? It's simply an SD signaling you or instructing you to unmute yourself. So the professor telling you that you're muted is what relative to unmuting yourself? An SD. Glenn is running DTT with the client. He tells the client to touch green and the client touches blue. So Glenn says, no, that is not it. Try again. Glenn does this 5 times in a row. What should Glenn try? All right, whose behavior are we looking at? We're looking at Glenn. The question is asking about what Glenn needs to try next. Because what is occurring in this question? Well, Glenn is running DTT, so he's running a lot of rapid trials. He's telling the client to touch green, but the client is touching blue. And he does this 5 times in a row. So we know the client is not getting it, and Glenn is just teaching more errors. Errors lead to more errors. So we need to prevent errors as they continue to pile up. What does Glenn need to do? Or what should he try first? A punishment procedure. Is a punishment procedure ever our first reaction? Almost never. Unless it's a serious, harmful behavior that we need to eliminate very quickly, punishment procedures are almost never our first option, especially when it's something as simple as DTT to touch colors. Okay, so punishment is not going to be his first example. What about a prompting procedure? What is a prompt? Well, it's a cue to evoke the right response. It's a cue for the client or the learner to engage in the correct response. It's exactly what Glenn is looking for. He needs to figure out how to break this cycle of wrong answers. A prompt would be a great way to do that. What about a non-contingent reinforcement procedure? Well, the contingent reinforcement isn't really the issue. So the non-contingent reinforcement isn't going to help here because Glenn needs the client to do a specific behavior. Remember, non-contingent reinforcement involves no behavior in particular. It's just reinforcement delivered on a schedule. And then D, switch to a naturalistic procedure. Well, if we don't have a DTT yet, naturalistic is probably not going to be the right choice. Naturalistic teaching is a great way to generalize, to maintain. We're still trying to get the client to learn it, right? We still need to see it in this controlled environment. So switching to naturalistic right now probably isn't the best option. So Glenn needs to find a way to get the client engaging in the right behavior. And the best way to do that is going to be through a prompting procedure. Every year, people start putting Christmas decorations out earlier and earlier. If you wanted to figure out how many days before Christmas you put your decorations out, what measurement could you use? Right, measurement questions. We need to identify what are we measuring? Well, we're measuring how many days before Christmas you put your decorations out. Ask yourself, is that a count or a time? Well, it's kind of iffy, right? Because how many, is how many days could be a length of time, or it could be a number. But relative to this question is asking how many days. So we're really just counting days, right? So don't get it too confused and don't overcomplicate it. If it's asking how many days, it's just asking you to count those days, right? So how are you going to measure that? Because we want to figure out how many days before Christmas we put decorations out. For example, if you put them out 25 days before Christmas, it's simply a count of how long before you put decorations out, right? So it's not that difficult of a question. Just be careful with the phrasing and how you look at it. So what measurement could you use? A, rate. Is rate going to tell us or be relevant to this? Because remember, rate is frequency over time. So we have a frequency. We have how many days. Do we have time, though? No, there's no time measurement here. We just have our frequency. So if we look at B, frequency, there we go. All we need is to count how many days before Christmas we put our decorations out. Duration, there's no length of time for a behavior. It isn't how long it takes you to put up your decorations. We're just counting how many days between or how many days before Christmas you put your decorations out. And then IRT, interresponse time, is just time in between behaviors, right? And we're not measuring time in between behaviors. Don't overcomplicate the measurement questions, okay? What are you measuring? How many days? It's going to be a count. All we need to do is select frequency. A student continues to forget to bring his homework to class. His mom decides she has had enough and takes away his Xbox, but he continues to forget his homework. Taking away the Xbox most likely function as what? Kind of a trick question. It's just to make sure you have this knowledge, right? What do we know about consequences? What do we know about consequences is that they follow behavior and they typically increase if it's reinforcing or decrease if it's punishing. If it doesn't change the behavior in any way, it's neither a reinforcer or a punisher. And we have to remember that when identifying if something is reinforcing or if it's punishing, you always look at its effect on future behavior. In this case, a student forgets to bring his homework to class over and over. His mom takes away his Xbox, but nothing changes. He still is forgetting his homework. So she attempted to decrease this behavior, but it definitely didn't work because he's continuing to do it. So we know it's not punishing. She didn't increase any sort of behavior, right? She didn't change any behavior. There was no effect, right? She took away the Xbox. There's really not an effect on the behavior that we can tell immediately. So is it a reinforcer? Well, no, she didn't change the behavior. Just like a punisher, she didn't change the behavior. If the behavior is not changing, the consequence is not a reinforcer or a punisher. So it's really unclear what Xbox being taken away functioned as. It isn't a prompt because a prompt is an antecedent and this is a consequence. So taking away the Xbox most likely functioned as unclear. Which of the following is not an example of an antecedent intervention? A couple of different things, okay? So we're looking at an antecedent intervention, which is just one of our terms. So let's define it. What is an antecedent intervention? It is an intervention that takes place before the response occurs as a preventative measure. With an antecedent intervention, you're trying to prevent something from happening. So we're looking for not an example, meaning 3 of these will be antecedent interventions, only 1 won't. So you're looking for 3 that are interventions that are occurring before behavior, and there's going to be 1 that is occurring typically or most likely after. So A, every 10 minutes, you provide verbal praise to a student no matter what. What intervention is this? Non-contingent reinforcement. If you provide reinforcement on a schedule, regardless of the behavior that is occurring, that is non-contingent reinforcement, and non-contingent reinforcement is an antecedent intervention. B, you forgot your iPad on purpose, so that is unavailable to your client. Well, if you forgot your iPad on purpose before you got to your client and before they could ask and before you could tell them or before you had to deal with the behavior and you did it so it's just unavailable even when you get to session, did you do it before the behavior occurred or after? Well, before, right? If the iPad is just unavailable, okay, even if they ask, they can't get it, right? So it's just completely unavailable even before anything occurs at session. So this is antecedent. See, when Glenn asks for a cookie, he is always told no. Okay, so Glenn asks for a cookie, he's then told no. Is this occurring before or after the response? Clearly after, right? Glenn asks for a cookie, he's told no. Not an antecedent intervention, it's a consequence intervention. Remember, consequence interventions are reactive. And then D, John says, throw away your trash, and then looks at the trash can, throwing away your trash is the SD. Looking at the trash can is a prompt. Both of these are antecedents, so they would be considered antecedent interventions, especially the prompt. So the only one that's functioning after the response occurs is Glenn asking for a cookie and being told no. Being told no is the consequence intervention. Make sure you understand that. Make sure you understand the difference between antecedent interventions and consequence interventions. Antecedent interventions are preventative. Consequence interventions are reactive. You're an RBT who just successfully identified several stimuli through a forced choice preference assessment. What must you absolutely do now under the supervision of your BCBA? This is a very important thing to know as an RBT. What is the purpose of a preference assessment? A preference assessment identifies potential stimuli that could potentially serve as reinforcement. Notice that word potentially. Just because something is identified in a preference assessment does not make it reinforcing. In order to make something, or in order to determine if something is reinforcing, you actually need to conduct another type of assessment. So you've already done the forced choice preference assessment. You've identified several stimuli. What must you do now? A, conduct a multiple stimulus preference assessment. There's nothing that says you need to conduct multiple preference assessments if the first one is successful. If you've identified stimuli, that's great. B, conduct a punisher assessment. Not relevant to what we're doing here, right? We're doing a preference assessment, finding out what they like. Just because they like it doesn't make it reinforcing. So what we need to do next is conduct a reinforcer assessment. So we have what they like. We have preferred stimuli. Now we need to figure out, do these stimuli actually change behavior? Do they function as reinforcers? So what you have to do next, conduct that reinforcer assessment. And then D, begin using the stimuli during treatment. Well, not yet, right? I mean, you can use it as, you can give it to them, but we just, there's no indication that it's reinforcing. A preference assessment doesn't tell us anything about its reinforcing properties. To do that, we have to go on and do a reinforcer assessment. What is a disadvantage of measuring behavior using permanent product recording? All right, we have a term. Let's define it. What is permanent product recording? Permanent product recording measures the outcome of a behavior. It measures what the behavior produces. If I give you a grocery list and you buy all the groceries, I can go back and look if you bought all the groceries. If you take an exam and I get it and I grade it, and I have now your permanent product of your exam. Okay, so what is a disadvantage of using permanent product recording? Because those are all advantages. What is a disadvantage? A, you must observe the behavior continuously. With permanent product recording, do you need to be constantly observing the behavior? You do not. That is a major advantage. You don't have to actually see the behavior occur. You just measure what occurs as an outcome of the behavior. B, you need to set intervals and measure them accurately. Do you have to set intervals for permanent product? You don't. Again, doesn't even matter because you don't have to observe the behavior. You just have to observe what it produces. C, permanent product is not always consistent. Yes, this is the problem with permanent product. It's not always consistent. If you're measuring self-injury, sometimes it leaves a scratch, sometimes it leaves a bruise, sometimes it doesn't leave a mark. That's going to be very difficult to get reliable measurements. So if you're going to use permanent product, try your best to make sure that the measurement is consistent or the outcome is consistent. And the permanent product does not work for young children. It absolutely does. The problem, or one of the problems with permanent product recording, is it can be very inconsistent. You might clean your room a different way. You might take a test a different way. You might buy different things. You might not leave a mark if it's self-injurious. There's many, many examples of how permanent product can shift over time. So using it continuously can sometimes lead to issues in accuracy of your data. Dwight is an excellent math student, but struggles with certain equations. The math teacher wants to target how Dwight thinks about the equations. What is the problem with targeting this behavior? A little higher level. Okay, but that's fine. We have to challenge ourselves every now and then to learn new things. What is the problem with targeting this behavior? Well, what behavior are we targeting? The math teacher wants to target how Dwight thinks about the equation. There's that key word, thinks. So we know he's an excellent math student, but struggles. What's the problem with targeting thinks? A, thinking is not a behavior. Thinking is considered a private event. It is considered a behavior, just an internal event. So there's nothing wrong with considering thinking a behavior. The problem with targeting it, though, is what? Well, B, thinking is unobservable. It's unobservable, it's unmeasurable. And we try to deal with things that are observable and measurable. Okay? How much Dwight studies would be something else. How he studies his equations would be something else. An internal event like thinking, very unobservable, very measurable, making it very difficult to change and track consistently. C, the math teacher should target behaviors that affect the entire class. Not necessarily. D, the math teacher should first ask the parents their opinion. Again, not necessarily. C and D are both good options, right? Things to consider, but that's not the real issue at hand. The issue at hand is, what is the problem with targeting this behavior? The problem with this behavior is it's not observable, making it very, very difficult to change. Finally, which of the following would be considered a primary reinforcer? What are our two types of reinforcers? We have primary and we have secondary. Primary is unconditioned. Secondary is conditioned. Easy as that. Most common primary, food, water, sleep, warmth. Most common secondary, money, tokens, praise. There you go, right? Easy as that. So we're looking for something that is a primary reinforcer, meaning unconditioned, meaning innate, meaning unlearned, however you want to look at it. So A, a client receiving their favorite toy after they eat their food. Is their toy a primary unconditioned reinforcer? It's not. These items, these tangibles, are all conditioned. They're secondary. B, getting a good night's sleep after a long weekend. Is getting a good sleep primary or secondary? Well, it's primary. You don't need to be conditioned to sleep. Everybody needs sleep given enough time. C, turning your house alarm off in the morning. Removing the house alarm is conditioned, so you don't set it off, right? It's secondary. And then D, receiving a token after engaging in the target behavior. Tokens are one of the most common types of secondary conditioned reinforcers. So which of the following would be considered a primary reinforcer? Well, getting a good night's sleep. You don't need to be taught or conditioned to want to sleep. Given enough time, everybody does it. Excellent. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe. Check out btexamreview.com. Questions, comments, let us know. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.